Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is the first video I'm filming since having sweet little Miss Savannah Grace. She might go hang out in the backyard with her daddy and brother while I'm filming the rest of this video. We'll see how she does, but I wanted to at least introduce her. And I also wanted to start this video by saying thank you because throughout my entire pregnancy with Savannah and really ever since having Judah, our firstborn, it has been a prayer of mine to get to experience an unmedicated VBAC. And by the grace of God, that is exactly what we got to experience for her birth. And I know that so many of you were praying alongside of us for that. And it was so sweet to see so many of your messages and comments just celebrating with us in that answered prayer. And so first of all, just wanted to say thank you. In this video, I'm gonna be sharing her birth story, which even though it was pretty much exactly what I was praying for, it also was so different than I expected, just the way that it all unfolded. And the birth story itself is actually pretty short. And so in addition to sharing the birth story, I'm gonna start by sharing what I did to prepare for a VBAC for any other mamas out there who might be wanting to do the same thing. And then even more importantly than that, just what I learned through the process of preparing for the VBAC and what God taught me through it, because that is really the heart of anything I share on this channel, is to kind of just share what God is teaching me through the different things that happen in my life to hopefully point you to Him and encourage you. So I pray that this is an encouragement to you. Another little disclaimer, I love birth. I feel like just through the two vastly different birth experiences that I've had, it's just driven me to do so much research and to learn so much about birth. And I just find the entire thing so fascinating, and I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. And so I'm gonna do my best to keep it somewhat concise, but the reality is this is probably going to be a long video. And so I'll go back and add timestamps, kind of sharing where I talk about like what I did to prepare for the VBAC for whoever that may apply to, and then the actual birth story if you're just wanting to watch that part. But let's go ahead and get into it. So if you don't know, a VBAC is a vaginal birth after cesarean. And so if somebody is sharing a VBAC story, that means they've had a previous C-section. And I feel like a lot of times it is so helpful to know the story of that C-section because it gives so much context to the story that then comes after it. And so if you're not familiar with my birth story with Judah, I do have an entire video going into all the nitty-gritty details that I'll link above if you want to check it out. But just to kind of summarize that here. So it was my first birth, our firstborn, and I would say as a first-time mom, I had done a good amount of research. I feel like I was fairly informed, fairly educated, pretty prepared. I knew about all the different interventions. My goal was to have an unmedicated natural vaginal delivery. And like I said, I feel like I did quite a good amount of like research and felt pretty prepared for that. That's obviously a good thing, to educate yourself, to learn, to prepare. But I think that in that there was honestly some pride in my heart of just thinking, well, I kind of know all the things I'm supposed to be doing, and so I'm going for this natural birth and it's probably gonna happen. And I remember when we were going through our birth course, there was a section on C-sections, kind of just saying like, even though if this isn't your goal, you know, here are some things you should be aware of just in case it happens, to have it, you know, be as smooth of an experience as possible. And so we watched through that section, but I remember thinking like, you know what, maybe some things won't go according to plan, maybe some of the like more minor interventions will happen, but there's no way I'm gonna have a C-section. Well, little did I know, I went into labor when I was 41 weeks and 2 days with Judah, and the entire labor ended up being 42 hours in total. And I was able to go from 0 centimeters to 10 centimeters successfully, unmedicated. And then I got to the pushing stage and I pushed for 10 hours and Judah was not descending, and it ended in a C-section. And it was quite the emotional experience, just having it be so vastly different than what I was expecting, and having gone through such a long labor, all of it, and then having it end in a C-section. And a couple of things we learned after the C-section as to why Judah wasn't descending. One, the big thing was his position. So Judah was both sunny side up and military presentation. So if you didn't know, the optimal position for a baby to be born in is the back of their head toward the front of your body. And then when they're sunny side up, that means the front of their face is towards the front of your body. It's also called posterior. And that can just make a vaginal delivery more challenging. It can make you have back labor. It can have lead to like a longer first stage of labor, all of which were true with Judah, except for I don't actually think that I had back labor, but it's still very much possible to have a vaginal delivery. The bigger thing that made it even more challenging, that again, we weren't aware of until we had the C-section, is that he was military presentation. So instead of having his chin tucked to his chest, which is the typical presentation for a baby, he had his neck all the way extended back. And when a baby is military presentation, that can increase the amount of space needed to pass through the birthing canal from 10 centimeters to anywhere from like 11 to 13 centimeters, because it's making it so that a bigger part of the diameter of their head is what's passing through. And so that's why he wasn't descending. And then the other thing we didn't find out also until we did the C-section is that I had a liter of pee in my bladder. Now, if you've ever done an ultrasound and kind of seen like where the bladder is in comparison to the birthing canal, you know that even having a little bit of pee in the bladder can really obstruct the baby's path and make it harder for them to pass through. And so that's why a lot of times providers will encourage you to pee before you push to empty the bladder. And to this day, I still don't really know why I wasn't able to pee, because I was using the bathroom throughout labor and nothing was coming out. So I just thought like, oh, I don't have to go. But I was also receiving an IV of liquid, so I definitely had a really full bladder. And so that's something I learned from his birth, is that it's really important to try to empty your bladder before pushing. And if for whatever reason you aren't able to pee and your providers suspect that you do have a full bladder, you can ask for a catheter to empty that, because that is really important to try to get that cleared out before you push. And so that's sort of the cliff notes of Judah's birth. And something I shared in his birth story video as well is that so many times throughout those 10 hours of pushing, I was praying, God, just like make a way for this to happen. Allow him to be born vaginally and allow it to be this beautiful story of you being glorified through making this thing happen that didn't seem like it was going to. And something God really showed me as I processed through Judah's birth is that sometimes God is glorified not just through him answering our prayers exactly the way that we would want him to, but rather through a display of his presence, even when things don't go at all as we would have hoped. And that was something that was just so abundantly clear to me in Judah's birth, that God's hand was just so in so many of the details.
It's a baby boy.
It's a boy.
Baby boy.
It's a boy. It's a baby boy.
And I learned so much through Judah's birth. I remember I also got a text from our doula shortly after he was born, and she said something that really just stuck with me and that I've thought back to so many times throughout my motherhood journey. And she was basically just saying like, you know, we can do so much to set ourselves up for the birth that we hope for and to influence the outcome. But at the same time, at the end of the day, we're not ultimately in control of how things unfold. And she was just saying how God uses our births to show us so much about ourselves and to shape us into the mothers and the people that he has called us to be, to advance his kingdom here on earth. And like I said, I've thought back to that so many times and just found it to be so true in my motherhood journey, because so much of the motherhood journey in my experience so far has been one of surrender, of learning that realizing that we are not in control, that we can feel like we're doing all the right things, and doing those things and doing them faithfully are so important. But at the end of the day, we're not in control. We can't, control how our babies sleep or how our feeding journeys go, or if they obey, or whatever the case may be. And doing the things that God has called us to do as mothers, and loving and caring for our children and teaching our children are so important, but we ultimately have to trust him with the outcome. And so I honestly feel like God really just used Judah's birth experience to kind of set me up for my motherhood experience, to humble me, to help me to rely on him and to remember that I'm not in control. And so it was really encouraging to get that text after his birth. And something that she also said to me that I'm so thankful for is she was just saying, Kaci, in reviewing your birth, here are some things that I think may have contributed to his position that we can kind of talk through and work on when the time comes for another baby. But I am so confident, Kaci, in your ability to have a vaginal birth. And she was just so encouraging about how I had handled labor. And I think it was just so powerful in the freshness of all that emotion of grappling with the disappointment of my birth having not gone how I wanted it to go. In the freshness of that emotion, to hear from somebody so much confidence of this doesn't have to be your story every time. And I am so confident in your ability to have a vaginal birth. And so I just want to share that with you. If you are a mama who has had a C-section, if you have ever been told once a C-section, always a C-section, or your body just can't give birth vaginally, or whatever the case may be, I just want to encourage you that that is not true, that there's so many cases where a VBAC is more than possible. And so I just I don't know, I'm just so thankful to have gotten that kind of bout of confidence and encouragement in the freshness of that emotion, because I think having that mindset and that just shaping my mindset was so powerful in then preparing for Savannah's birth. And so I knew pretty much right away after Judah's birth that I really wanted to have a VBAC in the future, and I pretty much dove right into researching about it and learned a lot of things. And one of the things that really shaped my mindset and gave me so much encouragement and a sense of feeling empowered right there in the beginning, probably like within a month of him being born, I came across an account on Instagram, Authentically Julie, I'll have her linked down below, and specifically a graphic she had shared giving the statistics about VBACs. So I feel like a lot of times if you are a mom who has had a C-section and you're considering like, do I want to have a VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, or do I want to have a repeat C-section? A lot of times providers will emphasize the risks that come along with a VBAC, which there are risks. The most significant risk that's talked about with a VBAC is the risk of uterine rupture. So if you've had a C-section before, that means you have a scar in your uterus, and the concern is that when you then go into labor after that, that scar could rupture open, which can be catastrophic for both the mom and the baby. And that is a real risk to be aware of, but it's also important to know that it is it's a very low risk. It's less than 1. And a lot of times that's the only risk that's given any attention, when in reality there's also risks to repeat C-sections. Those are not without risk. And Julie on her account had shared basically this, I'll have it up on the screen and I'll also have a link to it if you want to look at it more, but she shares the stats just giving the risks to both VBACs and repeat C-sections. And it basically starts at the top with, okay, if you've had a C-section, you can kind of follow these two paths of VBAC, second VBAC, third VBAC, or repeat C-section, second repeat C-section, third repeat C-section. And the stats were basically showing that if you follow the path of VBACs, the risks of a VBAC get significantly lower with each subsequent birth, and the chances of you having a successful VBAC get significantly higher with each subsequent birth. Whereas with the C-sections, the risks of a C-section get significantly higher with each subsequent birth. So basically, risk is going down with each subsequent VBAC, risk is going up with each subsequent C-section. And that's not to say that, a VBAC is always the right answer, or that that's what you specifically need to do. But I just wanted to share that because so much of the time providers will only focus on the risks of VBAC. And it was so empowering for me personally to learn, like, there's actually risks on both sides, and the risks of VBAC are a lot of times not as high as the risks of a C-section. And so for me, that was just really encouraging to learn that this is more than a viable option for me to pursue. And it's also a safe option to pursue because there's risks on both sides. And so once again, that's not me saying that one is better than the other or that one is right for you, but that is me encouraging you that if you are a mom who's had a C-section, to find a provider who is going to educate you on the risks and the benefits of both options, because both options do have benefits and risks, and it's really important to be fully aware of those on both sides so that you can make an informed decision of what is going to be best for you. And so it was really helpful for me to find that. I'm gonna look down at some notes I have now. So all that lead up aside, let's fast forward now to getting pregnant with sweet little Miss Savannah girl. So we found out we were pregnant when Judah was 13 months. We got pregnant shortly after he was a year old, which means that the age gap between Judah and Savannah is 21 months. And that's something to be aware of if you are wanting to have a VBAC, is a lot of times providers will recommend that you have at least 18 months between the two births. And that's not to say that if you have, a shorter gap than that you can't go for a VBAC or that you can't have a successful VBAC. But that was something I asked after Judah's birth, just to be aware of kind of the recommended time to allow your body to heal and also to reduce risks of uterine rupture. And so they were going to be, they are 21 months apart. And so now I want to go kind of into some of the things that I did to prepare for a VBAC, specifically once I was pregnant. I have a little list here that I'm going to be looking down at, but I also want to give the disclaimer before I go into this list that I feel like, especially as a VBAC mom, I feel like there can be so much pressure to feel like you have to do all the right things and you have to do all of them perfectly. And I just want to encourage you by saying that you can't, that you cannot do all of the things, you can't do all of them perfectly, that there are constraints of time, constraints of money, and it can feel really overwhelming to feel like unless I do every last thing that any person has ever recommended to prepare for a VBAC and I do it all perfectly, that I'm not gonna have it, that can just feel like so much pressure and so overwhelming. And so my encouragement to you is to hear this list, prayerfully consider like, what is realistic for me to do? What is gonna be most helpful for me to do? How can I best spend the time and the money that I have that is limited toward this goal of having a VBAC? And I also just wanna give the reminder again that it is in God's hands. I remember after Judah's birth, seeing a couple different friends post about how they had done chiropractic care their entire pregnancy and that was why they had a really easy pregnancy and only pushed for 10 minutes. And I remember reading those posts and thinking like, I also did chiropractic care throughout my entire pregnancy with Judah, and I didn't push for 10 minutes, I pushed for 10 hours, and it still ended in a C-section. And so if you're a mom who has had a C-section or who has had a birth not go the way that you hoped that it would go, I just wanna encourage you that that doesn't mean that you did something wrong or that you didn't do enough or that you didn't do all the right things. And while sure, there's probably things you can learn from your birth to take into the next one, there always are those things, it doesn't mean that you did something wrong. And then conversely, if you are a mom who has had a birth go exactly the way that you wanted it to go, I just want to encourage you to remember that that is a gift of God's grace and to thank Him for it. Because I think now as a mom who's had both experiences, the birth that did not at all go according to plan and the birth that did, I think that sometimes when things do go the way that we want them to go, it can be really easy, at least speaking for myself, to pride ourselves on that and to feel like, well, this happened because I did all the right things and I did X, Y, and Z. But I know that there's so many stories of people doing X, Y, and Z and things not going the way they wanted it to go. And also so many stories of people not doing anything at all to prepare for birth and having it go perfectly, or, there's just all different outcomes. And so I think we just have to remember that God is in control. It's a gift of His grace. He's sovereign over all things, and He has stuff to teach us and good purposes in all of it. And so now getting into what I did to prepare for a VBAC, have a little list here. So first thing is obviously to just process through it with God, process through it with people in your life, process through it with your birth team. I think that it was so helpful going into Savannah's birth to have a birth team that wasn't just, the on-call doctor at the hospital who I had never met before, who didn't know me, who didn't know my story, but rather to have a birth team who knew my birth story with Judah, knew the fears I was working through and doing my best to not bring into this birth, and knew the points in my birth with Savannah that fears were likely to come up because those were the points in Judah's birth where things kind of started to not go the way that I was hoping that they would go. And so it was so helpful to process through that with the people who were going to be in the room with me so they could know when and how to encourage me in her birth. So that's really important. I would say probably one of the most important things after that is to find a supportive provider. So I think that there's a lot of providers who will say like, yes, we'll let you try for a VBAC or we'll let you do VBACs, but there's a huge difference between a provider who will tolerate a VBAC and a provider who genuinely believes in it, who will genuinely support you in it. And the provider we had with Judah, I asked some of those questions literally at like my 6-week checkup. I think it was the 8-week checkup because I had a C-section after his birth, asking some of those questions. And they're like, yeah, we allow VBACs, but if you haven't gone into labor by 41 weeks, then it's an automatic repeat C-section. A provider who says something like that is not truly a supportive provider, or a provider who says something like, yes, we do VBACs, but we won't allow inductions. Whereas a provider who is truly supportive is not going to put arbitrary restrictions on when you need to go into labor by, so long as mom and baby are safe. A truly supportive provider knows that some methods of induction are safe for VBAC, and while it is best to try to avoid any inductions because it can increase your risk of uterine rupture, a truly supportive provider knows that there's some that you can do, that you can resort to as an option before just going immediately to a C-section. And so it's really important to find a provider if you're wanting a VBAC who's truly going to be supportive of that. I found this little kind of chart that shows kind of some character qualities of a provider who will tolerate a VBAC versus a provider who will truly support a VBAC. It's from VBAC Facts. I'll have the little graphic up here, but I'll also again link it below. So that was really helpful for me and helped me decide who I was going to go with when I was kind of figuring that out with her pregnancy. And in the beginning, I was considering a home birth. That was something I had been considering with Judah before we moved as well. And home birth is totally a viable, safe option for VBAC as well in most cases. And honestly, if you look at the statistics, your chance of having a successful VBAC actually goes up with a home birth, because a lot of times that means you're working with a midwife who understands the physiological process of birth. And so that was something I was considering. And I actually did interview a couple home birth midwives in thinking through that. And it was actually through those conversations that I needed to, I think, be honest with myself and realizing that I personally felt most comfortable being in the hospital. And honestly, one of the home birth midwives that I was interviewing was the one who kind of was like, I think that this is what you truly want. And I just needed to admit that to myself. And the big reason for that for me was just knowing that even though something like a uterine rupture is incredibly low risk, like, or there's such a small chance of that happening, knowing that if I was that 1 in 200 or whatever the exact stat is where that happens, that I was going to be in a place where I could have the care that I needed immediately available to me rather than needing to transfer. And I felt like knowing that I was in a place where I could receive that care should it become necessary for me was going to give me more peace of mind. And so for me, the decision was more about that peace of mind than anything, of knowing that I didn't want to bring unnecessary anxiety with me into labor, because anxiety can literally inhibit the physiological process of labor and birth. And so I was like, okay, I think I do want to have a hospital birth, but I want to make sure I have a provider who is truly supportive. And that home birth midwife I interviewed was actually the one who recommended to me the OBGYN that I went with. And she was just saying, if you want to have a hospital birth, he's your guy. He's who you got to go with. He is an incredible OBGYN, but he's so naturally minded. Like, his wife had all their babies at home, and he is just known specifically for supporting VBACs as well. And she just was raving about him. So I ended up doing my own research on him, set up an appointment, and he is about 40 minutes away from us. But after meeting with him and doing my research and just feeling so confident about what I was looking for, I knew it was the right decision for us, and that driving a little bit extra was going to be worth it to have a provider who is truly going to be supportive. And so if you are in the greater San Diego area and you're looking for an OBGYN who's just very naturally minded and wanting to have a hospital birth, but somebody who's going to really support the natural birth process, send me a message or an email or whatever, and I'll give you his name, because he is truly incredible. And we are so thankful that we went with him. But the one thing that made me a little bit sad about choosing the hospital birth route is missing out on the more comprehensive prenatal and postnatal care. So as incredible as our OBGYN is and is, the OBGYN model of care is still typically, a 15-minute appointment where you're going to have your blood pressure checked, your weight checked, you're going to be able to ask your questions. And I will say his office was incredible in just creating time and space for me to ask questions and never made me feel rushed. But still, the midwife model of care is just much different in that a lot of times it's like, a 1-hour visit at home where you're going over, yes, the vitals and checking the baby and all that stuff, but they're also talking to you about emotionally, how are you doing? And they're building a relationship with you, and they're going over, what does your nutrition look like, and what does your movement and your exercise look like? And as you get towards the end of pregnancy, they're checking not just, is baby head down, but what position is the baby in, and what are some different body work movements we can do to get the baby in a more optimal position. And so in choosing hospital birth, I was like, man, I'm kind of bummed to not have that, more comprehensive, holistic prenatal care. And also postpartum care looks very different, because in the hospital setting, once you're discharged, it's typically, come back to our office for the 6-week checkup, versus when you're working with a home birth midwife, they will come to your home a day after birth, 3 days after birth, 5 days after birth, at the 2-week mark, all the way up through 6 weeks. And in those visits, they're providing care to you, checking on seeing how your healing's doing, how are you doing mentally, how is breastfeeding doing, but they're also providing care for the baby. And so I was like, man, I'm kind of bummed to not have that, even though I want to have a hospital birth. And that's when I learned that you can have the best of both worlds. And it was in one of those conversations or interviews with the midwife that she told me about this, that you can do something called concurrent care. So you can have your care through your OB and plan to give birth in the hospital, but you can also do care concurrently with a midwife who is going to come to your home and do all those prenatal visits, do the postpartum visits, and that sometimes you can actually get discharged from the hospital sooner if you have a midwife who's going to be coming to your home to provide that care. The midwife we worked with, her name is Amanda Wynn, and if you're in the San Diego area looking to have a home birth or to do concurrent care like I did, I'm going to leave all her information down below. It was truly the best experience experience just having her come in and build a relationship with our entire family and feeling so supported by her immense knowledge, her expertise, and her encouragement throughout the entire process and through the postpartum period as well. And then the other part of building my birth team was hiring a doula. Hiring a doula can decrease your chances of a C-section and increase your chances of just having a natural intervention-free birth by a lot. And our doula, her name was Trish. She was absolutely incredible. She came to our house for a couple prenatal visits and just did massages, and again talked through our birth story and talked through different positions and coping techniques for labor and through my preferences for how she could best support me in labor. And again, you'll hear more about her as I tell the birth story, but I think the first step in preparing for VBAC is to find a supportive provider and to just build your birth team. I think that was so crucial. Savvy girl went in the backyard. But the next thing is prenatal fitness. So Bridget, again, our doula with Judah's birth, she has like a whole prenatal, postnatal fitness program, and I cannot recommend it enough. I started doing the prenatal fitness program literally like right around the time we found out that we were pregnant. And it's not just to like, let's get in the most intense workout that we can get in, but they're very purposeful workouts that just help to prepare your body for labor, help to create optimal room for the baby. And it was so helpful to do, one, because you're preparing your body for labor, but also the breathing techniques that she kind of incorporates into the different workouts. I feel like by doing them over the period of 9 months, they just became so ingrained in me. And they're breathing techniques that then become really helpful for labor as well. And so I feel like they kind of just became second nature by the time labor was here. And so cannot recommend that enough. I'll link that below. Also, kind of on that same note is posture. So one of the things Bridget had told me after Judah's birth as to why she thought that, you know, Judah could have been in the position he was in was some of my postural tendencies. And so specifically, I have a tendency to tuck my pelvis under. So if you imagine kind of like sticking out your butt, the opposite of that would be like tucking it under. And this, in addition to like some of the ways we sit, like if we're slouching and just like not sitting upright, that can encourage the baby to be OP, which is the sunny side position. Gravity is making it so that the heaviest part of their head is going to the back of you rather than to the front of you, which is what is going to be the most optimal for birth. And so I tried to just be really mindful about posture all throughout my pregnancy, in sitting, in the way I was sleeping, in standing. Obviously was not at all perfect in any of those things, but I tried to just be really mindful of it. Next is chiropractic care. Chiropractic care, and specifically finding a chiropractor who does the Webster technique, can really just help create optimal space in the pelvic area for baby to be in the right position. Next is protein. I don't know that this specifically helped labor, but something I really tried to focus on in this pregnancy that I did a lot more than I did in Judah's pregnancy was eating a lot of protein. And this just helped with a lot of things. I had a lot less swelling than I did in Judah's pregnancy. My nausea went away sooner. I gained less weight, which I do think can contribute to just the birth process, especially if you're really trying to stay active and take care of your body in that way. And so that was something I wanted to mention as well. Raspberry tea. So in my pregnancy with Judah, I kind of did raspberry tea a little bit towards the end of pregnancy. And I'm not like a big hot tea person though. So drinking a cup of hot raspberry tea every night, like it felt like a chore, and I honestly wasn't super consistent with it. But this pregnancy, my midwife recommended to me a NORA tea blend, which has the raspberry tea in it. I actually didn't add the raspberry tea until like 30 weeks because just for like peace of mind, having had a previous miscarriage before. But NORA tea is nettle, oat straw, rose hips, raspberry tea, and alfalfa. And so I would just buy all of those different teas loose leaf in bulk on Amazon and then mix them in like an equal parts ratio. And she recommended to me to do it iced, which literally changed the game for me because, again, not a big hot tea girl. And so I would just make a big batch of it every week and then drink a glass of it every day iced. Sometimes I'd add a little lemonade in, and it was like a little Arnold Palmer situation. And so that made it a lot more enjoyable, and I was very consistent with that. Dates, not super consistent with that in either pregnancy. I tried finding the best ways for me to eat them. I think my favorite way was to cut them in half and put a little bit of grass-fed butter, which was good, but I still just got tired of them really quickly. And so I did try to do them especially as we got towards the end of the pregnancy, but I honestly wasn't super consistent with it. Next is a pelvic floor physical therapist. This is something that I feel like so many people recommend if you're going for a VBAC, and honestly just any birth, and especially like postpartum recovery. I think it's so helpful, but it can also be really expensive. And so I was like, man, is that really necessary? And it just felt like one more thing. But then when I was probably about 7 months pregnant, I was talking through it with my midwife, and she was just saying like, you know, I do think that I've seen a lot of success and it just be a really helpful thing, especially for women going for a VBAC. And so I would encourage you, even if you can just go like once or twice, like it doesn't have to be this thing where you're going 2 times a week throughout your whole pregnancy. I think for me, it was helpful to hear that it didn't have to be an all or nothing thing. And so I did end up looking into a pelvic floor PT, and I thankfully was able to find one covered by insurance. I encourage you to look for the chiropractors and the pelvic floor therapists that are covered by insurance. They're rare, but they do exist. And I know that all those things can get really expensive. And so I was able to find one that was covered, and I went, I would say maybe 4 times in the last 2 months of pregnancy in preparation, and it was really helpful. And that was something my midwife said too, like even if you can't go a million times, like even just going once or twice, they can give you different things to be working on and assess you. And so that can be really helpful as well. And so that is sort of what I did to prepare for the birth. And now going into the birth, I want to share a couple things that happened before labor actually began that I think were really important. So right around 37 weeks, or just before I was at 37 weeks, our midwife came over for a home visit, and she was going to be doing body work. So basically checking the position of the baby and then giving Tyler different exercises he could be doing with me, like side lying release and the jiggle and all the things if you're familiar with it, to help optimize baby's position in preparation for labor. And at that visit, she found and told me that baby girl Savannah was sunny side up. And when she told me that, she was not concerned at all. She was saying like, you know, you still have a lot of time for her to move. And even if you go into labor while baby is OP, like babies can change from sunny side up to the correct position during labor. And most of the time they do. And even if she doesn't, she can still be born sunny side vaginally. But I did know, and she did tell me, that it can make a vaginal delivery. It can make a VBAC more challenging, and it can make it more difficult. And looking back, it feels like, okay, like, you know, that was discouraging news, but I took that and I was so discouraged. And I think it was kind of the same thing of feeling like, man, I've been doing like all these things during pregnancy and putting so much time and so much money and just effort into doing everything I can to have this VBAC and desiring it so badly. And despite doing all these things, like baby is sunny side, and it's gonna make the VBAC more challenging, and maybe it might not happen. And it was something that I wanted so badly. I think that part of why Judah's birth was so difficult for me is because I truly loved getting to experience my body do what it was created to do throughout the process of labor. And it felt like I got to see it all the way through, right up until the very end, and then I didn't get to see it through. And so going into Savannah's birth, I was like, I just so deeply wanted to experience my body getting to see that process through. I also think having had a C-section, it can be really tempting to believe the lie that somehow that was like a less than experience, or that it wasn't a legitimate birthing experience, which is not the truth. But I think if you're a mom who's had a C-section, at least again, speaking for myself, it can be really easy and really tempting to believe those lies. And so I was afraid of just having a C-section again. I was afraid of the emotional pain, of the disappointment of putting all this work and all this effort into having a different experience and then going through all of that again. I was afraid of going through that process again, of the physical recovery, of being cut open again. All throughout the pregnancy, whenever I would hear the story of somebody having a VBAC, I would literally cry hearing that story, just imagining what that moment could look like for me and so deeply desiring it. So I think being at that point in pregnancy and being told that Savannah was sunny side up and feeling like, wow, this might not happen, it was so discouraging and so frustrating. And there were a lot of tears that weekend. And honestly, like I said, a lot of frustration of just feeling like I'm doing literally everything I can be doing, and she's still not in a good position. And like, this is probably just going to be the same thing all over again. And while that was very emotional, I honestly feel like that was a really good thing, because as I wrestled through all those emotions with God and talked through them all with Tyler, I honestly feel like it brought me to a place of surrender and realizing that my desire for a VBAC was a good desire, and I could do what I could do to try to make that happen, but that I couldn't make it an idol, and that I had to accept the possibility that there was a possibility of it not going the way that I wanted again, and of it ending in a C-section again. And I think it was hard to come to that place of acceptance and surrender, but I think also really freeing to come to that. And so that was kind of a significant part of the story leading up to before labor, of once again realizing that there's so much power in the things that we can do to prepare for birth, and that is all that is in our control. Only thing that we can control is doing those things and doing them to the best of our ability, but realizing that how birth unfolds is not ultimately in our control, and finding freedom in that and just focusing on the things that are in our control, which has so many implications for so much of life. And probably like a week or two after going through this whole process and coming to more of that place of surrender, Bridget shared a post that really encouraged me. I want to read it to you. There's kind of more slides, but the two that stood out to me most, she said, "There's so much we can do to tip the scale in our favor to a happy, healthier, easier birth. But part of preparing for birth and motherhood is also learning how to surrender. It's important to take a step back and ask yourself, am I doing these things because it empowers me and makes me feel confident, or because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't do them?" And she's referring to kind of all the things you can do, the eating the dates, the raspberry tea, the curb walking, the different exercises. And I think that was just really encouraging for me to remember, like, am I doing all of these things out of a place of fear, or am I doing these things from a place of empowerment, in recognizing like, this is what's in my control and I'm gonna leave the rest to God. And so I think that was an important place of surrender for me to come to before the birth, even though it was scary to accept the possibility of another C-section. And then from that point though, I was like, you know what, well, I'm just gonna be really diligent with the things that are in my control. And so from that point forward, from like 36 weeks through the rest of the pregnancy, I started doing the Spinning Babies Daily Essentials video every day. It's like probably, I forget how long the video is, maybe like 25 minutes, but it's $15. You can download it from their website. I'll have it linked down below as well. And it just walks you through kind of like all these movements that help, again, create optimal space for baby. And also started doing a couple times a week the different bodywork stuff that Amanda gave us to do to try to get baby girl to turn from the sunny side position. And honestly, it was kind of a mind game over the next couple of weeks, because I was doing these exercises every day, and I had also kind of learned how to feel for her position and feel if she was sunny side, and feel like, you know, okay, if I can feel her limbs in the front, that means the front of her is towards the front of me. But then if I can feel her spine and kind of her back, that means she's in more of like the optimal position. And she kept moving around. Like there would be times where I could feel her back on my right side or on my left side, or times where I felt her limbs and I was like, oh no, she's gone back to sunny side. And so it was kind of just this mental game of like, okay, I need to just stop stressing out about what position she is in or what's going to happen or how it's all going to unfold, and truly just focus on what is in my control and trust God with the rest, and trust that like whatever happens, He's in control. And so then that leads us to the weekend before my due date. So I was due on a Monday. The Friday before my due date, for whatever reason that night, I was up all night with it coming out of both ends. I was thrown up, it was coming out the other end, and I just like felt so sick. And I didn't think that it was food poisoning or anything, because Tyler was fine, Judah was fine, my parents were fine, and we had all had dinner together the night before. And so I was texting my doula, and she said that's actually an encouraging sign, because a lot of times that can happen as your body's preparing for labor. There's like a massive kind of hormonal shift, and sometimes people can get nauseous or have diarrhea or all the different things. And then I was texting a couple of friends who had said like that totally happened to me like a couple days before I went into labor. So I was like, I'm so excited, like it's probably gonna come. And you know, you get to the end of pregnancy and you're just antsy for things to happen. And so I was like, okay, things are gonna start to happen. And so my doula was just encouraging me to rest as much as possible. And I literally was like not getting up off the couch that entire Saturday, because I just felt so weak and so sick. And I was really thankful that labor hadn't started yet, because I was like, man, if I'm starting labor feeling this week, like that is not gonna be good. And so thankfully I made it through Saturday. And it was hard to kind of fight that mental battle too of like laying on the couch so much of the day, because I knew that wasn't like the best thing I could be doing to help baby's position. But I was like, I'm just doing the best that I can. And then come Sunday, I was feeling like a million times better. So I started doing more of my movements, and I was thinking, okay, is labor gonna happen? And then Monday comes, still nothing has happened, and it is my due date. And I was so discouraged once again. I literally like called my midwife in tears, and I was just like, my body's just not gonna go into labor, which again sounds so silly talking about it now, because it's like, it was just my due date. So many people go to their due date, beyond their due date, 2 weeks past their due date. That is totally normal and common. But if you have ever gotten to the end of your pregnancy or past your due date, you know that honestly your mind can just start to play games with you, and it just can feel like you're never gonna go into labor. And I was just starting to go down the thought process of, man, like I'm gonna be super past my due date again, because I had gone almost 2 weeks past my due date with Judah, and the baby's gonna get really big, and it's gonna make it harder for me to have a VBAC. And I was just getting so discouraged. And so I talked through it with my midwife, and she was just encouraging me and encouraging me to pray and to just do my best to relax and to not focus so much on it. And then that leads us to the next day, which was Tuesday, September 17th. And my parents were here because they were waiting for baby to come. And so we were out getting groceries. And I remember like at different points I was holding Judah, and then I was like, Dad, I need you to hold him, because I was just feeling like a lot of pressure. Not like contractions or anything, but just almost like the baby was dropping really low. And then that night, Tuesday night, we all had dinner together at Tyler's parents' house. So my parents, Tyler's parents, all of us. And there were a couple times during dinner where I was like, I think maybe I'm starting to have contractions. They were no longer the Braxton Hicks where it was just like a tightening. It felt like actually painful, but they felt so different than I remember the contractions feeling with Judah's birth, because with Judah's birth, I remember feeling the contractions in like my whole stomach, uterus. And this time I was feeling them kind of just like under my stomach, almost like where my C-section scar was. And there wasn't like pain on the scar itself, but it felt like the muscle, that's like kind of mainly where I was feeling the contraction. So I was like, I don't know that this is actually labor. Like this feels really different, but it does feel painful. I'm not sure what's going on. And we were texting our doula. And so we have dinner, and probably all throughout dinner, like every 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, I would kind of have to like brace myself a little bit. But I was still in complete denial that this could even be labor, because it just felt so different than my first experience, and at that time my only experience with labor. And so we get home, we put Judah down, and our plan for birth is that we would have Tyler in the room, obviously, my mom, our doula, our OB, and the plan was that our doula would come to the house for early labor and then go with us to the hospital when it was time to like be in active labor and all of that. And so we put Judah down for bed. I remember we're like sitting on the couch, laughing with him, playing with him, and we put him down, and kind of throughout his bedtime, I'm like, I think maybe I'm having a contraction. It was like pretty intense, but again, it just felt so different. So I was like, no, this isn't labor. And we get Judah down, and then Tyler's like, I think we need to start timing these. And I was like, no. Because I know like if you want to have a natural birth, the best thing to do in early labor is to just pretend like you're not in labor and go about your life until it's like to the point where you can't ignore it. So it's like, we're not going to start timing things, because in my mind, if this was labor, we still had like 2 days to go, because that was my experience with Judah's birth. And so I was like, let's not start timing it, because like, I don't know, like this seems like a lot more intense than Judah's, because I was like bracing myself every time they come. So he starts timing it, sends a screenshot to our doula, and they're happening like every 3 minutes, then 4 minutes, then 7 minutes, then 5 minutes, but they're only 20 seconds long. So my doula was like, yeah, they're still pretty short. Like I would just kind of go about your night routine, try to get some rest if you can, maybe take a bath, take a shower. So I get in the shower, and within like a minute of being in the shower, I am like yelling for Tyler to come in with me, because I'm like, I need to like hold on to you and brace myself, because they were just all of a sudden like one after the other, and they were so instantly so intense. Because again, comparing it to Judah's birth, from the time that my contraction started, it was 26 hours before we even went to the hospital, because it was 26 hours before they started to get consistent and intense enough to go to the hospital. And at that point I was just in active labor. I was at 6 centimeters when I was admitted with him. And so they progressively had gotten more intense over a period of 26 hours. And so the beginning ones were really, really mild. This time they started and they were instantly like, bam. Like I remember with Judah's birth, Tyler kind of described how I handled it as like very zen, how I was just very internal and breathing, and you kind of couldn't even really tell that I was having a contraction, but I was. And you know, especially as I got to the end and they were really, really intense. But this time I was incredibly vocal. I was just like, I couldn't help it. Like I was loud. And so we're like, well, I don't really know what to do. And so I got out of the shower because that wasn't comfortable. And we're like, well, let's try to do like our stretches. And then I couldn't do those. And so I was like, well, maybe we should call the doula, because these are getting really, really hard for me to cope through. And so maybe I still was like worried that it was going to be too early, but I was like, I don't know what to do because I'm having a really hard time coping. So maybe we should at least call her and have her come to the house. And I was like, well, maybe I should try to like lay down for a little bit first. And then I couldn't lay down. So I was like, well, maybe I should try to pack my hospital bag. And so I would go get one thing, and then I would have to like brace myself and stop and then go get the other thing. So at that point we did decide to call the doula. She listened to me through 2 contractions, and she was like, yep, I am not coming to your house. You're meeting me at the hospital now. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, are things actually happening? But then I was scared, and I was worried that we were going to be too soon, and that, you know, they were going to send us home, or that I was going to be going in too soon, and that was going to increase my chances of interventions if things were still really early and stuff. But then she was saying we needed to go to the hospital, and our midwife was saying that. And so Tyler calls both of our moms and they come over because the plan was for his mom to stay here with Judah. And then my dad was gonna be driving me, Tyler, and my mom to the hospital. And so thankfully, my dad had put plastic on the seat in his car along with pillows, towels above it. And that was a very good thing because we get in the car and 10 minutes into the car ride, my water broke. And I remember my mom asking me, like, as we were getting into the car, like, are you feeling a lot of pressure? Like, maybe we should go to a closer hospital, because mind you, we had picked the OB who I wanted to work with, but it was a 40-minute drive. And this was like, you know, at this point, maybe 11 o'clock at night. And so there wasn't gonna be traffic, but she was like, I don't know if we're gonna make it to the hospital. And I kind of snapped to her. I was like, we're going to the hospital that I've picked, because I was so afraid of just, you know, being at a hospital where there was an on-call doctor who I had never met and not knowing what they thought about VBAC or if they were going to truly support it. So I was like, we're going to my hospital, and I didn't tell her that I was feeling so much pressure. And then I remember I kept asking them throughout the ride, like, how far are we? Are we almost there? And Tyler just kept telling me we're almost there. And I remember looking over at his phone at one point and it said 8 minutes left. And I was like, oh my goodness, because it was so intense. And I just kept trying to tell myself through each contraction, like, okay, after every contraction, you're a minute closer to the hospital. You're a minute closer to the hospital. And then for probably like the last 10 minutes of the car ride, I was definitely pushing, like, involuntarily, and I didn't tell anybody that until like after the birth, because I was like, I just gotta do what I gotta do. Like, I can't even stop this or control this. We just gotta get to the hospital. And so it was very intense. We get to the hospital. They didn't even take me to triage or anything, because I was just so very clearly like in the thick of it. They take me right to a room. They check me, and I was 10 centimeters. So that was a huge relief to be like, okay, at least I didn't, you know, I was so afraid of getting there and then being like, you're at a 2 or you're at a 3 and whatever. But I was like, oh, okay, I guess it's go time. And so I had been, like I said, kind of involuntarily pushing through the last part of the car ride. And they were like, well, wait for the doctor to come in and then we'll start pushing. And I'm like, girl, I've been pushing, but we'll, like, you know, actually coach you through it and all the different things. And so our doctor got there and we start pushing, and there was probably about an hour of pushing where it felt like no progress was being made. And I was pushing in different positions. I was like on all fours doing lunges. My doula was like walking me through different comfort measures and different positions to try to get the baby to change and just create movement. And I definitely started to get really in my head, because it felt like I've been here before. Like, I got to 10 centimeters with Judah, I got to the pushing stage, I started pushing, and, you know, he just like didn't descend. And so it definitely started to become a mental battle. And I know that everybody says, you know, every birth experience is different, and just because it went one way one time doesn't mean it's gonna go the same way that time. But I think that it's really hard to not let the one experience that you've had color your expectations for what you think the next experience is gonna be. And I feel like in that place of like, okay, I'm pushing and it feels like no progress is being made, I was like having to just trust God with that he was rewriting that experience. But I definitely was really afraid and just having to fight all those thoughts. And I kept asking, like, is she coming? Is this gonna happen? And the doctor was so encouraging and just coaching me and just talking me through the different things and just saying, we just got to get her past the pubic bone. And then probably like an hour into pushing, they ended up putting a mirror down there, and were able to kind of like really high up there see just like a little bit of her head, which was encouraging, but also like I had seen Judah's head. So again, I'm just like battling these thoughts in my mind and just trying to keep pushing forward, trying to do what I can and just focus on this experience. And then it ended up being, I think, actually really motivating and encouraging to have the mirror down there, because I was able to like visualize where to push, and also like slowly start to see her come down a little bit and a little bit. And then after, like, I pushed in total for just under 2 hours. And so a ways in, I'm not sure how long, we started to see her head come down more and more. And then it was just like sitting there, and there's this tension of like, oh, she's like right there and I just want her to come out. And I remember I kept asking questions. I'm like, is this considered crowning yet? Like, are we past the safe point? Is she past the pubic bone? And he just did such a great job of like encouraging and coaching, but also like diffusing the situation with humor. And so I kept pushing, and Tyler was right there, and the plan was for him to catch baby girl, catch Savannah. And so her head came out, and the ring of fire was definitely the most wild thing I've ever felt, because obviously I did not experience that with Judah, but it was like, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. Like, we're having a VBAC, she's coming out of me. And so then her head came out, and the doctor was helping to like guide her shoulders, and he was also coaching me through like, okay, here's when you need to push and here's when you need to slow down, and was like dousing me with oil to try to prevent tearing, which I'm very thankful for, because he said it didn't even qualify as like a 1st degree tear, but like a very minor, I think lacerations is what he said. But I feel like the oil and the like coaching and not pushing too hard when I was crowning really helped prevent some of that. And so then she came out and Tyler caught her and I started to pull her up to my chest, and I didn't realize that they were all telling me like, oh no, like the cord was wrapped around her body. She was totally okay. It wasn't around her neck. It wasn't an emergency situation, but I was like pulling on her and the doctor was like, wait, like I need to like unwrap the cord from her. So he then unwrapped it and put her on my chest, and Savannah Grace Harlow was born on September 18th at 12:51 a.m. after literally just about 5 hours of labor.
We'll give you one little push down and then Tyler will reach down.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you. Hi, baby girl. Hi.
I'm so incredibly thankful for the answered prayer of getting to experience a VBAC, for a healthy baby, for just complication-free. I did have quite a bit of bleeding after the birth. It wasn't over like whatever the concerning amount was, but they did end up having to administer Pitocin after the birth to slow the bleeding, because there was quite a bit, which they say can happen with a VBAC, but thankfully there was, nothing beyond that. And once they gave like 1 dose of Pitocin, I was totally okay. But it was just an incredible, wild, surreal experience. And there was almost this feeling of like, wait, did that just happen? Was she really born? Because it was just so different than my first experience, where it was 2 days long, and here all of a sudden 5 hours later she's in my arms, and I'm like, kind of like, what just happened? Like, did that even just happen? But it's just such a testament to the fact that, every single birth is different, and just because you've had a certain experience one time or things went one way one time does not mean that's how they're always gonna go. And so that's our birth story. Thanks for listening. If you made it through this entire thing, I hope that it was encouraging to you, and that if you're a mom who's wanting to go for a VBAC, that it encourages you in that, and hopefully gives you some things that you can apply or just learn as you are preparing for that. I know that I was so thankful for all the different stories I listened to of people who just encouraged me that it was possible, and different things I gleaned from what could help me prepare for that. I remember when I was listening to Allie Beth Stuckey's VBAC story. She had a vaginal birth after 2 C-sections. She was just sharing how she had longed for that experience, but then how when she did have the VBAC, how it was redemptive in ways, but how it didn't like complete her, it didn't change her life. And I feel like I resonate to that too, that I'm so thankful for the experience, but also just recognizing that like every birth experience is a true birth experience, and that my vaginal birth with Savannah was no more legitimate or better than my C-section birth with Judah, and both births taught me so much, and God was sovereign over each one and the way that each birth unfolded, and had things for me to learn and glean from each one, in ways that he was shaping me through it to look more like him and to more equip me for being their mom, and just for, like Bridget said, advancing his kingdom here on this earth. And so I hope you can be encouraged in whatever your birth experience has been, or just your experiences in general, that God has a purpose in all of it, and that he's using all of it to shape you more into his image and to prepare you just for the purposes that he has for you to fulfill. And something that I've realized too in talking to a lot of mom friends is that no one person has everything easy, meaning like no person has pregnancy go perfectly, and birth go perfectly, and feeding go perfectly, and sleeping go perfectly. Like every single mom has at least one of those things be difficult or feel like a challenge. Like I have one of my friends right now that feeding has been a challenge, but sleeping has been great. And for us, feeding has always gone smoothly, but sleeping has always been hard. Or like, sleeping is a little bit more smooth with Savannah than it was with Judah, but daytimes have been harder and she's been more fussy. And I feel like God never allows every single thing to be easy, because the point isn't ease, the point isn't our comfort, but rather the point is God using those things to conform us to the image of his son, and teaching us to rely on him, to depend on him, to humble us and point us toward him and toward our need for him. And so I just want to encourage you in that whatever the hard thing is for you, whatever the challenging thing is for you, that God has good purpose in it. And so I'm going to stop rambling now, because this story was probably already way longer than I intended it to be. But once again, I pray that it encouraged you. And thank you so much again for listening and for praying for us. And we were just so thankful for our sweet baby Savannah girl. So thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.